You're listening to Beyond the Couch podcast with Dr. Sally Nazari, where we look at you beyond the couch and build ways to enrich your life, share your triumphs, achieve your goals, and most importantly, where we'll be celebrating you. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beyond the Couch podcast. I'm your host, licensed clinical psychologist, Reiki master teacher, Dr. Sally Nazari, and I'm looking forward to sharing today's topic with you. I'll be speaking with Lauren Selfridge about emotional wellness in living with health challenges. Lauren is an associate marriage and family therapist in San Francisco, California. She works with couples, individuals, and people living particularly with chronic illness. She herself was diagnosed with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis in 2015 and has found that although living with an autoimmune disease is not an easy path, it's brought more joy and fulfillment into her life than before. In fact, in January of 2018, she launched the podcast, This Is Not What I Ordered, to devote a weekly interview show about full-hearted living with chronic illness and health challenges. Lauren believes that the biggest challenges in our lives are often invitations into a deeper, richer, more conscious relationships with ourselves. And she'll be sharing that wisdom with us today. So let's get started. Hello, Lauren, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to talking today with you. And like I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we're going to be speaking about emotional wellness in living with health challenges. So why don't you get us started, Lauren, with telling us a little bit about some of the struggles that people with chronic illness have with wellness?
One of the things that you probably are familiar with, being a therapist as well, is that there are certain things that bring people into the therapy room. And, at some point, I feel like it doesn't matter what brings you into the therapy room. What matters is that you're there, because there's so much that we can explore in therapy. So while there are certain issues that can come up for people with chronic illness, I would say the most important thing to keep in mind is that people with health challenges have a lot of the same issues as everybody else. The difference is that we also are dealing with a very significant situation with our bodies. So it's sort of like you're layering the physical situation on top of what life is already bringing to the average person. So what it does is it kind of flavors life. And I like to think of my relationship with chronic illness, because I had multiple sclerosis, as really an invitation to deepening my relationship with myself. So all the issues that might be difficult in my relationship with myself get magnified when I have to deal with what's going on with my body.
I really like the way you describe that, right? Because like you mentioned, things are still going on, all the reactions to life, all of what it means to be human is still happening. It's just that there's this added layer for us to explore. And one thing that comes to mind for me, Lauren, as you're describing that is, on the one hand, it can be really challenging. On the other hand, what an interesting opportunity to explore those things in a different, more deepened capacity.
Definitely. And there are specific issues that come up that are kind of common themes with the clients that I work with, like talking about how do we receive help and support in a way that we might not have been used to in the past if it's a new condition. Dating, figuring out how do I disclose my health challenges to someone who I'm in a new relationship with. Issues around picking medication, dealing with medical staff, making big decisions about the future. There's so many things that are specific to living with health challenges that it can be really helpful to
have someone on your team who's specifically there for your mental health. And this kind of brings me to the next question coming to mind for me is, how does this impact people's lives? And one of the things that you had said a couple minutes back was that it doesn't really matter what brings us into the therapy room. It matters more that we're there, right? And how things unfold there as well. So I'm reminded again of that as you're talking about certain themes that pop up, and also the idea of someone really being on your side, being on your team, and offering you that support as we navigate just a different sense of our physical and emotional health. Yes. So maybe we can explore that a little bit further. How does a different way of dealing with our physical wellness impact the emotional wellness that we have, and also what goes on in our lives? We have these areas of limitation that show up. And so one of the big themes that could come up, and I do work with people who, most of the clients that I work with have had life prior to getting a diagnosis where they didn't identify as having a health challenge. And then they got a diagnosis, and maybe it's a new diagnosis, or they've been living with it for several years or many years, that the theme of fear can really come up, because when you're getting this new information, often our relationship with our future begins to change. And so one of the things that can come up is whether or not to begin doing a whole bunch of research on the topic of a health condition. Because especially with a new one, it can actually be incredibly overwhelming to go online and look at all the statistics. It can also be really empowering. So part of making the right decisions has to do with reflecting on, what are my needs right now, and who am I surrounding myself with? Do I have someone that I can debrief with? Can somebody literally hold my hand as I search online? Do I want to just leave it completely up to my doctor this week or this month and just say, I'm just going to go with what my doctor's saying and recommending? That we start to take more ownership of the process when we can take a step back and breathe and just kind of think about how we want to approach this. But then, there are these very clear issues around our futures are often different than we planned. We thought that we were going to have a certain type of life, and then we find out that, for some people, they have progressive conditions, or they just have recurring issues that are never going to go away, or that maybe they'll go away. And so rethinking what it means to live a fulfilling life is so important, because I think our culture puts a lot of emphasis on physical wellness, and it's a very unconscious thing. And I didn't realize it until I got my own diagnosis, that a lot of how I identify in the world has to do with my physical energy. And so one of the main themes I like to work with clients on is it possible to still have a really awesome, fulfilling life, even though your body isn't doing what you originally planned? How can we adjust what success looks like? How can we reassess what is most important and meaningful so that you can still fulfill your heart's purpose in the world? And actually, just as a side note, I actually think getting a health condition hits the fast forward button on finding meaning in our lives, so that we get to live even deeper lives, even fuller lives, maybe sooner than we would have if we didn't have a health challenge. I think you're putting that so nicely. It was one of the first thoughts as you were talking earlier that came to mind for me, that, here's an opportunity now to delve a little bit more deeply, because there is that sense of urgency. There is that sense of, let me re-examine things and go beyond just what's always been readily available to me. I think you described that so nicely, Lauren. There are so many elements of our lives that are wrapped up with what's happening for us physically, so that when that's sort of compromised or different now somehow, or it's not what we understood and have always related to, it can be jarring. And of course, we do need that sense of support along the way. But in doing that, at the end of the day, figuring out what our life now can consist of in a more deepened, fulfilling way is a really beautiful way to just approach moving forward.
Yeah, yeah, it's exciting actually. It's not all exciting. It can be, like I said, very scary, but I do see it as a really powerful, exciting process.
And I think you touch on a really important point as well, that even though it's not exciting and something to be welcome 100% of the time, it's still an exciting process. And I think it's natural that anxiety and stress would show up. So
Yes.
what role would you say that they play?
So, it's like anxiety gets such a bad rap and stress gets such a bad rap. And I understand why they can cause a lot of harm, but they come from a place of wanting to protect ourselves. So when we look at why would I be nervous and anxious? Why would I be afraid that my life's going to change? Well, it's because our bodies are trying to protect us, and anxiety is very much a physical process. So when I'm anxious, my chest gets tight, my jaw might get tight, my heart rate will increase because my body is trying to protect itself from impending danger. So one of the things when you're learning things about your body and you're learning that your body literally is in danger, it's sort of like really, actually, I can't even imagine not having some anxiety about that.
Absolutely.
It's like we want to protect ourselves. That's part of being human and having a body, is that it just literally, our brains are wired to keep it going. So part of it's about figuring out, back to this mindset piece, like, what is it about my relationship to my body that's going to help me to feel the most empowered? And for me, I can just say personally that I will get these symptoms that show up, and I can really, especially in the first few years after my diagnosis, respond to those symptoms with fear. Because to me, there were these thoughts around, the symptoms never going to end. It's going to get worse. I'm going to fall, because dizziness is one of my symptoms. So I would go into this, I would start to kind of spin out internally. And in the process, the symptoms got even worse because my whole system was freaking out. And that's okay too, but it started to give me some really important information. And I realized that, as therapists, when we talk about welcoming emotions and inviting in even the most difficult emotional experiences, that I could apply that to how I deal with my physical symptoms. And instead of fighting it like it was the end of the world, I started to invite the symptoms in. And what I found was a few things. One was that it actually took the power away from the anxious part of me, because I was no longer resisting it. And it really started to help me level out and feel more grounded. But in the process, I was also able to experience what the symptoms brought to me, because I believe that symptoms usually have information for us, where our experience of the world is shifted, whether we would like it or not. And anytime my perspective shifts, I learn new things. So I started to learn to ask for help differently. I started to learn to actually enjoy not being able to control conversations the way I was used to, because I would get brain fog and I wasn't able to be as much in my head. So I was actually more in my heart. So there are all these things that I was able to uncover once I realized that I could embrace the symptoms, which, by the way, I don't do it all the time. This is like in my best moments, I can embrace the symptoms.
There's so much information in that I think people can really just sit with and digest. And I love that you shared that, because the process, again, it just reminds me of some of the comments you were making earlier, about how we now relate to our future and ourselves in a very different way. And at the same time, it extends that further and highlights that we can relate to our anxiety and even just our discomfort, both emotionally and physically, in a very different way. And it can be something that it's not only the speed up button or the fast forward button, I should say, but almost like a magnifying glass, like what is really going on for me here? What is it that I need to tune into and understand a little bit more deeply about myself, about my symptoms, about my life, I would even say.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it really feels sometimes when I look at all of this, it can be helpful for some people, not for everyone. It can be helpful to look at it as a game. So it's
Oh, I
like,
like that.
it's like, and only if it feels like you want to own it as a game, not because we think that your life is just a joke. It's actually something that you would have to decide for yourself. I don't want people to feel like, they're supposed to think that their life is a game. But if you feel empowered and you say to yourself, okay, I have this fork in the road, I'll get points if I go on this. If I go this way, I'll get points if I go the other way. What are my choices here? And how can I gain the most points? And if the points equal fulfillment, satisfaction, self-discovery, like how am I going to be able to really get to know myself better in this process?
I love that. And I do think the exploratory, adventurous element of a game here makes a lot of sense as opposed to something that we're dreading, that we're afraid of. And of course, there will be times when we're feeling that way. But on the whole, looking at the experience as something in that vein, I think can bring with it a lot of value. And you gave us a really good example of how that could be the case. So I'm wondering if depression kind of fits in here. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, so there's depressed feelings, and then there's also clinical depression, which is definitely something that shows up a lot for people, along with having chronic illness. And I think that it's important to recognize that it's very common. It's not an easy process. I think having depression, it really needs to be treated with a psychotherapist, and so that's something that I would be very clear on. If you're not dealing with depression, I don't think that it's more of a personal choice about whether or not to be engaged in therapy. But I just, one of the things about clinical depression is that I don't want to say that there are these easy answers, because that's part of the definition. That said, there are ways that we can deal with down days, that we can deal with when we're feeling a depressed experience in the world, which is so normal and it's part of being human. Like I just wrote an article on it's sort of like a love note to people who are at home when they would rather be out in the world. And it's a very lonely experience. It can be very discouraging to have your spirit want to be out doing things and your body is not up for it. And it can feel very unfair. And so it's like, what do we do with our feelings when we don't have control over our bodies in the way that we want to? And so what I say in that love note is feel all the feelings. Just let yourself, if you can, feel all the feelings and take breaks. You don't have to feel your feelings 24/7. You can, watch movies and talk to friends or journal or sleep. But it's important to allow ourselves to grieve, to feel sad, to be in the process of mourning, and really letting ourselves be disappointed by what's happening, because it can be really harmful to just have, force ourselves to only have a sunny approach when that's not how life is. Life is bitter and sweet. So part of living a fulfilling life, in my opinion, is allowing ourselves to feel the depth of the emotional challenges that come along with having disability or chronic illness.
And I think it's a big part of just being human and accepting that we are a whole human being, even if it feels like there's happening for us. And I really love that love note that you mentioned, and I'm happy to link to it in the show notes so that listeners can get a chance to go through all of the pieces. And as you're describing, feel all of the feelings, one thing that came to mind for me is that doing that can actually be a really important part of self-care. And I think it makes a lot of sense that needs are different and probably even increasing. Self-care becomes a very crucial thing for us. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the role of self-care in this process.
Yeah. Well, all of life is self-care. in my opinion. Every moment in our lives, we are the companion to ourselves. We're the ones that will be with us every moment from birth till death. And so, what I mean when I say that is the part of us that's able to acknowledge life, to see what's happening from a little bit of a removed perspective and say, oh, wow, I'm feeling sadness, or oh, I'm feeling fear, that's the part we want to develop and really begin to give it more and more responsibility for being kind to ourselves. So that's part of why I'm a big fan of mindfulness, because it helps us to start to just notice our internal processes. And so self-care is about many things, one of them being allowing ourselves to kind of be like our own unconditionally loving parent who's there for us no matter what, and who has complete openness and acceptance for whatever arises. Because the fears and the anxieties and the disappointments are all part of being human, and they're a lot easier to feel when we can acknowledge that we have many parts to ourselves, including that like inner parent, inner loving part that can kind of shepherd us through the difficulties. So I think of emotional self-care in that way. And then there's also other forms of self-care, like just being really conscious of what's a little thing that I can do in this moment that would help me to feel a little bit more cozy or a little bit more safe. Or if I have a big decision to make, checking in with, am I doing this out of fear? Am I doing it out of obligation? Do I have a need that's not being met? So self-care can take a lot of forms. And I think with one of the things with living with a health challenge and medication, that I actually think there can be a really neat way to practice self-care when we've chosen a medication, or when we have a medication that we need to be taking, is to create a relationship with the medication. And I think, it brings up a lot of emotions for people, a whole range of emotions, to be literally taking medication into our bodies. And one of the things I recommend is creating some kind of either a ritual, or writing a letter to the medication, or doing something to really begin that relationship, establish it as your own. And I found that for me personally, it's really changed the way that I experience taking my medication. I feel like it's more in my own control in a way, because I'm saying, I'm welcoming this medication in, and I'm thanking it. I'm thanking the medication for what it's bringing to me. And, sometimes I'll go for a walk by the ocean with a friend and kind of just sit together, and she'll listen, and she'll let me just kind of say a prayer about my medication. And, I get an infusion twice a year. So it's really nice to do that right before I go into the hospital. And that to me is like the highest form of self-care, because not only am I taking care of my body by getting my medication, but I'm trying to be as loving as possible around the whole process.
I think ultimately that itself is the biggest act of self-care we can. And you're also giving us some really key ways that self-care goes beyond just the immediate things or the most obvious things that we're thinking of. And that's a big theme that I'm hearing throughout our conversation today.
Yeah.
So I think this question naturally just kind of makes sense, following all of the different key points that you've highlighted for us. But let's just kind of circle everything back and tie everything together. What would you say people with a chronic illness can start doing to better navigate their lives? And you've given us some tips along the way, but maybe we can just kind of go through a couple.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things is I definitely encourage people to find a psychotherapist or a coach who specializes in working with health challenges. And it doesn't have to be that they specialize, but I do think that if you can find someone who really gets what it's like, that can be incredible to have just a therapist who sits with you and can go through that process with you. Because when, especially weekly therapy, big fan of weekly therapy, when you have the knowledge that you can go in to an office or meet online with somebody who's following your progress, who's with you on the path, it can really change that feeling of being alone, which can come up a lot for people with health challenges. And so that's one piece is, kind of fostering your own emotional wellness by being in regular contact with a therapist. Another one is to get involved in communities of people who understand what it's like as well. And so one of the ways, I think probably one of the biggest ways that people are getting involved in communities is online. There are Facebook groups, and there's a website called patientslikeme.com where people can be in honest communication about what they're going through. And it can be really powerful to go from feeling like I'm the only one in my life who gets what I'm going through, which is actually probably true for a lot of people, to being able to email with someone or read an account from someone who has a similar situation.
Those are some really awesome tips, I think, just in terms of the different pieces of our lives that we've integrated into our day-to-day, but also the emphasis on support and getting a sense of someone who's walked through this path or is walking through this path alongside you. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Anything else that you'd like to add for us today? You've done a wonderful job giving us an understanding of how we can navigate disruptions that come on with health challenges.
I think I'll just say that, like I said at the beginning, dealing with a health challenge is a lot like dealing with any challenge in life. It's not easy. You can develop parts of yourself through the process that you might not have been able to develop before. To give yourself a lot of kindness and consideration around the fact that nobody's perfect and that it's so normal to feel big, difficult feelings and that that's part of the process as well. And also that if you have a health challenge or a chronic illness, there's something very important to recognize about your own wisdom, because just the fact that you're getting through this is a big deal. So pay attention to the wisdom that you're gaining in the process, because that is something I think we can forget how much we're learning and growing. Often because there's this idea that if you're staying home or if you're not quote unquote productive, that means that you're not as worthy. But I actually think that it's quite the opposite. You're going through something that not everybody has to deal with. And I just think people with health challenges have this insight that the world needs to hear. So I would encourage people to keep in mind that they probably have a lot more wisdom than the world might be reflecting back.
Absolutely. And I think you described that very nicely. It often might feel like just because other people don't get it or it's not what's immediately valued, that it must be absent. And that's certainly not the case. And I think just in going on and living and sort of reflecting that and expressing it and exhibiting it, it can be one way that we contribute to other people understanding that, so that there can be more that is reflected back. Very nicely described.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Lauren, you've given us a lot of really important information today, and I think it can be helpful to so many people who maybe themselves are going through a health struggle or have a loved one who might be doing the same and now have much more insight into it. I'm sure that people are going to want to reach out to you and learn a little bit about your work and your podcast. What are some ways that people can learn about you and your practice?
People can visit laurenselfridgetherapy.com to check out my psychotherapy practice. I work with clients in San Francisco or online anywhere in California. And then my podcast, which is called This Is Not What I Ordered, is about full-hearted living with chronic illness and health challenges. And you can go to thisisnotwhatIordered.com and check out the episodes. There's a directory there for therapists and coaches who get what it's like to live with health challenges. There's a lot of good stuff going on. There's even an online community called the Podcast Cafe that you can check out on thisisnotwhatiordered.com/cafe. So there's a lot of great tools and resources there.
Sounds like a wealth of information. Very, very exciting. So
Yeah.
again, I wanted to thank you for being here with us today. It was such a pleasure talking with you about a really key topic.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I think it's a wonderful topic.
All right, we've had a wonderful conversation with Lauren, learning a lot about emotional wellness while navigating health struggles. Before we wrap up, as we continue to spread the podcast love, I did want to share with you another podcast that I find absolutely fascinating. It's the Sacred Psychology podcast with Tamara Powell. This is a wonderful podcast for mystics and misfits from licensed therapist and empowerment coach Tamara Powell. Through stories and interviews, Tamara takes everybody behind the veil of psychology to a place where neuroscience and spirituality go hand in hand. I've linked to it in the show notes so that you can be sure to check that out. Now, until next time, take care. You're listening to Beyond the Couch podcast with Dr. Sally Nazari, where we look at you beyond the couch and build ways to enrich your life, share your triumphs, achieve your goals, and most importantly, where we'll be celebrating you. Let's get started.